Written in stoners. What is happening? It's been a long summer over here. It's feeling like a long summer anyway, and we are hard at work on season 2. At the same time, I'm trying to get out and climb as much as possible. I've made myself a goal to finish 100 513s by the time I turn 50, which is in October. I'm at 94, so it's going to be close. I think I can get there, though. The question is, can I get there and still get season 2 out by the end of October like I planned? I don't know. We'll see. Something may have to give. But it's coming regardless, and it's going to be great, just like season 1 is. Now, today I'm talking with Remus Knowles, who is the head of software development over at Lattice Training. And I had known Remus's name through the training world. And then he reached out to me middle of season 1 just to say he was a fan of Written in Stone and what I was doing, and to let me know that he runs climbinghistory.org, which I had no idea he was running. I had been using it as a resource for pretty much every episode of the season. So I really appreciate the work that he was already putting in. And I could see that we both came at looking at the history from a different perspective, which was really interesting. So recently I was thinking it would be fantastic to have Remus on to talk about who we missed, to have him interrogate and criticize season 1 and maybe help me see it through a different lens, which could also help inform how I approach season 2. And you will not be hearing from me on the other side of this podcast, so just know that all of the things we mention will be linked right there in the show notes, including some of the videos we talk about, as well as climbinghistory.org. And you should just bookmark it. Next time you're arguing with someone about who did what and when they did it, or where this happened, or the context of that history, you can just go to climbinghistory.org. All right, let's get into it.
1, 2.
When I started researching for this thing, of course, the first place I'm going to go is Google and looking online. And I very, very quickly honed in on a few different websites that had a lot of great information I could pull from. One of those is climbinghistory.org. It's climbing-history.org. And while looking through there, it really occurred to me that the different approaches to sort of chronicling the history of climbing can be really, really valuable. Like, I went into this thing thinking, I want to tell stories because the stories aren't really being told in this like concise, formatted, well-told way. Like, we get to hear lots of people talking about these things now on podcasts, which is great. And I'm pulling from all of those. But I also want to make them like mythological in scale, the way that the stories that I heard when I was a new climber were given to me, But going through some of the websites, particularly yours, climbinghistory.org, it occurred to me, like, you're a data guy, I'm an audio guy, so I'm going to chronicle this history via audio, via storytelling. You're gathering and cataloging this history in a more data-centric way. And I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think, like you say, it's really interesting having those two kind of different approaches. And you're totally right. Like, I think initially when I started out with climbing history, I was trying to go down the same sort of route as you and like really tell the stories, but I pretty quickly realised I was rubbish at writing. So I start trying to write like a little bio and then get a paragraph in and be like, oh, I'm stuck. I can't write anything more. And it's just sort of morphed into the way I kind of look at it now. It's a bit like Wikipedia or something like that,
Yeah,
where
yeah,
it's
yeah.
almost like a kind of like an index on top of all like great quality stuff like you put out, and all the things you have via other podcasts and YouTube these days. Um, I see it as a way to sort of like collect that information. And like you say, I think there's a real place for like everything to sit in there, because you're not going to sit down and sort of scroll through climbing history for an evening, but it's really fun to put on audio podcasts and have a listen.
Yeah, and it's really great to like, there are lots of times when you're just sitting at the dinner table with your friends or whatever, and some ascent comes up from the 1980s or 1990s, and there's a debate about did it happen this year or who did this first. And with your website, this like repository of all of these facts, and we can just Google it and it pops up, and we go to climbinghistory.org and it shows us like here's the answer to what you're looking for, which I really love having available, especially when I'm writing these episodes, so that if I'm like if I'm not sure on a year or something like that, I can go check your website first. Like that's the easiest way for me to do it. So it's it's this interesting um, way that they feed into each other. And thank you for putting links to last season's podcast episodes and on some of your pages. I appreciate that. And I want to like repay you here by introducing all of the people listening to your website. It's harder to just give a link, but I can have a conversation with you and get to hear your passion for this
Yeah,
history
no,
as
of
well.
course. Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed listening to all your episodes, and like I say, but that example you gave of sitting down at the table when you're chatting about a particular ascent, and
Yeah.
what I found really frustrating when someone would be like, "Oh, I found this great video of Fred Nicole back in the day doing the first ascent of something," and everyone would be like, "Oh, great! Oh, I can't remember where that was." But yeah, but
Yep.
now with climbing history, you've got a place where you can put that video and it will just appear, and it's really easy to find it. So that's kind of what I was saying about there having it as like an index or a reference.
Yep.
It gives you all those little tidbits to hand where you can go in and you can be like, "Oh, I can find that cool video," or like you said, you can find out particular dates, or and then the sort of next level on top of that as well is because it's like a sort of structured database.
Mm-hmm.
You can start putting all these like lists together. So that's kind of where the like hardest boulder problems in the world or hard on sites or whatever it is. But you can, because you've got the data in this like structured format, you can generate that stuff automatically. There's I think there's a lot of resources out there that are kind of hand curated, and people do an amazing effort putting these things together. Like I've seen some really good lists about like all the hardest flashes of bold problems in the world.
Yeah.
But it's really manual. It takes a lot of work, and it's one of the
Mm-hmm.
kind of cool things with climbing history is that you can kind of get that stuff like for free in a sense. Once you put the data in, it's just kind of there forever, and you can chop and change it however you want.
Yeah, totally. And that's so perfect for me because I'm the person who like does a ton of research, makes the manual list that I write down in a notebook that I can't find 3 weeks later, That's so I have to redo the whole thing. That's the type of person I am. I've made no like secret that I'm not a data person. We have a data guy because I am not that guy. I appreciate it and I love when it's available to use as a tool, but I'm not the guy who collects it and keeps it in an orderly fashion. So I
Oh
appreciate
yeah,
that you do that and that it's out there.
yeah. Well, I think the strength is when you have both approaches. Like if you think of all the stuff on climbing history, like that, most of the research on there is like from listening to like your podcast and loads of other podcasts, just watching like endless kind of 1990s VHS tapes and
Yeah. Yeah.
really scrolling back through the archive. But if people didn't write those articles or put those magazines together or record those podcasts, like there'd be no source material to work from. So it's really
Yeah.
like climbing history really builds on everything that people like yourself do. It's definitely not like without all those sources, it would be a kind of like a pretty boring, dry site, really. And
Mhm.
I think it's all those videos that really add to it and make it like really interesting, and they kind of make it much more exciting, in my opinion.
For sure. And when I'm like putting an episode together, the first thing I do is start researching a little bit. I generally have a story arc idea in my head, from like figuring out who I'm going to talk about to begin with. But then I start researching, and the first thing I put at the top of every page are just a couple of resource links so that I don't have to go searching every time. And those are usually their like wiki page if they have one, and climbinghistory.org, because there are going to be the videos and links to other articles and all of that stuff on there already. So it's such a great resource. I'm curious though, what got you so interested in the history of climbing that you needed to catalog it and create this database?
It's funny. It kind of started off. I posted it on this forum called UK Bouldering, which is like it's pretty niche. It's like it's
Hmm.
very UK focused. It's very
I've
sort of like
I've been there a
Sheffield.
lot. Yeah.
Yeah, good for like sort of Sheffield rumour mill kind of if you need information like that. Um, but I posted on there about it's a lot of people on there are like really geeky as well. So they love all this kind of like, oh, who was the first person to do whatever. Um, but I posted a question that was something along the lines of like, how many British men have bouldered 8B or harder? We
Hmm.
started putting like a very manual list together on there. And at one point, because I would just copy and paste this list each time someone wanted to like, add a name. And at some point, I was just like, okay, this is too annoying now. I don't want to keep copying and pasting. And I was like, how can I like structural this data a bit better? So my background is in like programming and data analysis and that sort of thing. So I kind of naturally went into that down that kind of avenue. So basically,
Sure.
like built out a bit of a database, and then the website is like a front end for the database that lets you kind of add in new Ascents and things. Um, and essentially, it just grew off the back of that initial list, really. So I had that kind of like filled out the first few climbers, the first few climbs, and then sort of started adding in lots of other bits as well. Because once you've got a list of strong UK climbers, you're like, well, add Wanderer, it's a strong climber, might as well add him in, see what he's been up to, and just by this kind of like process of like slowly adding more and more things into it, it just kind of grew and evolved. And I think what I quite enjoy the kind of listy aspect of it sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It gives you a bit of something to aim for. So instead of just adding people randomly, you're like, oh, I wonder how many people have climbed 9B plus. So it's
Yep.
quite a short list, so it's quite easy. You can just kind of like Adam Odra, Jakob Schuber, and you can just keep working through them. And then before you know, you've got a pretty complete list. Um, and then you're like, oh, maybe I could expand it down to 9B. So we go on, and and just quite naturally like that, it just keeps growing and growing. Um, and I've kind of taken it now into I've added some tools that like help me add data a bit quicker and just kind of like just a quite sort of natural progression really. And I think actually that my kind of interest in climbing history has kind of actually grown with this site. I would say to start with, I probably
Mm.
wasn't super engaged with the obviously aware of the kind of like the big stuff like Fred Nicole and big names from the past like that. But I think I've kind of got more and more into it as I kind of started working with the site more and putting more and more data in. Because I think it's kind of natural, isn't it? You read about something
Yeah.
interesting and you read about their friend. And you're like, oh, I've never heard of them before. You do a bit of
Hmm.
research. Turns out actually they were a really good climber. They did loads of good stuff. But and I find those kind of like people who are like maybe not the big names, but like one tier removed from that. I find those kind of
Yep.
people really really interesting because often, I think often their stories are like have as much depth and detail as the big names, but just aren't as well known.
Yeah, totally. And for it's the same for me. Like I've always loved climbing history, but I'm more of a consumer of it. And now that I'm like creating this thing and I get to like dive into the details a little more, I get to see all these interactions between the big names and the people who were like making groundbreaking ascents, and who that sort of second tier of climbers at the time were, and how they were contributing to pushing this top level even higher. You know, it's Olympic time right now, and I was looking at the 400-meter women's hurdle records last night, and it's really striking that the last bunch of times that the world record has been broken, it's been done in a really big international meet. And that's because of the level of competition that you're racing against, you know? And I feel like that also happens in climbing, and we don't give it enough credit that when there's a Fred Nicole breaking these barriers, even if he's not a competitor at heart, there's also a Clem Loscott right behind him, doing these things that's pushing Fred to be better as well. And Fred's pulling Clem up at the same time. And then the next wave of boulders are being pulled up in their wake, I think it's really fascinating to see all of these different interactions. And that sort of leads us right into this thing that I wanted to talk to you about. And that's the fact that for season 1, I had to make some choices. Like, I had to look at the entirety of the 90s and say, initially my thought was, what are the 10 most important ascents? And then I got it whittled down eventually to 11, and I just couldn't bring myself to cut one of those 11. And it was really hard to get to that point. There are just so many things that I feel like were important. So I wanted to have you on to sort of interrogate season 1 a little bit and say, why in the hell didn't you have this guy in there or this woman in there? They should have been there. They did great things. What were you thinking? And what I think we should do is just maybe jump in with the list of things you've put together, and I'll add in a few of my own here and there, and I'll either defend my choices or I'll acquiesce that you're right and I should have done it the other way.
Yeah. I think, to be fair, I think you did a great job. I think it was like, I was kind of waiting for some rogue choices to come in there, and every episode that came out, I was like, oh yeah, no, that's a really good shout, actually. Yeah, no, that was a big ascent. Yeah, that was like a really important moment. So I think it's been quite hard, like picking out other people. Like, there's a lot of ones in here that are sort of like, I think they're all borderline. I think, they all could have been sort of top 15. I think, but I think you did a really good job getting that top 10. So I think my first one on the list, I think, which is probably the biggest omission for me, would be Alex Huber. I think maybe the tricky thing with him is that what's impressive for me is his kind of overall, his kind of consolidation of the kind of like 80 plus, 9A plus kind of range. So I think other people definitely stepped in and, like, Ben Moon, Wolfgang, establishing the first of the grade. But then I feel like Alex really came in and kind of took over from those guys and sort of really ran with 9A and made 9A like a much better defined thing. So you've got Om in 1992, and then Viceroy's in 1994. Actually only 2, 3, 4 years after Ben was doing Hubble and Wolfgang was doing Action Direct. So going back to your point about you've got these top tier guys, but actually the people underneath are probably a very similar level, really. But we remember them because they're the first, and then the people who come later actually again operate at a very similar level. I think the other interesting thing with Alex is a sense of the Rumbler in Sierrana. So I mean, I think it's quite a hard one to talk about, isn't it? Because there's quite a lot of he initially did a shorter version, I believe, and then it was extended later on.
And there was some debate about that. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, with a little rest out right and all this sort of stuff. But I think it's kind of easy to say this looking back, but I think now that's actually a really impressive ascent. And obviously I haven't climbed it myself, but the impression I get from other people is actually the extension doesn't really add a huge amount. So
and that's what he says as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very good climbers like Ad Wanderer, I think have said similar. But actually, the meat of it is in the first part. The extension doesn't add a huge amount, and that's pretty well established at 9A plus now. And he did that in 1994, so it's a really impressive effort for the time. But I think because of the sort of muddied waters around the extension and the rest and all this sort of stuff, kind of get a little bit lost in the history books. And similar with his route, open air. Again,
Yep.
I'm gonna butcher the name here, but Schleier Wasserfall
Yep.
in Austria. Yeah, I think that was 1996, and I think he suggested it at 9A, but it waited ages and ages for repeat. I think everyone who's repeated it since has suggested 9A plus. So again, really,
Has
really
it been
early
repeated
example.
more than once? Isn't Adam the
Well, good
only repeat?
question. Yeah, potentially. Oh,
I think he
Jakob.
is.
Yeah, Jakob's done some other things there, but I don't know
Yeah,
whether
he
he's
did.
done
He
open
did
air.
Vice Bros.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I mean, well, I assume probably Jakob's probably put a bit of time in, given I think it's a very local crag for him.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's not going to be a walk in the park, is it?
Yeah, he's such an interesting piece of this. He was the 11th that I couldn't cut, and it was like the things he was doing were never the first, or at least called the first at the time, which made it cloudy, And then when I was researching the Fred Ruling episode, and I came across all of this like hatred that Alex Huber had pushed toward Fred Ruling and Bernabe Fernandez, I was like, I was very angry at Alex Huber, even though I don't know him at all, So I'm just like, wow, this guy is a bully. I'm not including this guy in the season, And then I just couldn't like delete him from the history as bad as I wanted to. And I had to find a way to bring him in. But for my own happiness, I had to do it in a way that didn't give him full flowers. So that became the Free Rider episode, where it was like, okay, Free Rider was this thing that changed history. It really opened up big wall free climbing to the masses. So I did do the Free Rider episode where I very briefly mention his sport climbing, but then I also try to take Free Rider away from him a little bit and give it to all of the individual ascensionists of each pitch. He was a tough one for me, man. But I get what you're saying. And I also, I think I want to do a whole episode on the history of La Rambla eventually, because it's such a complicated, fascinating history. And then open air, I had considered talking about it in the 2000s when Ondra repeats it, as part of some episode, not its own episode, but part of something. But you're right. He deserved to be in there as much as I didn't want to put him in there. And the mentions that I did give him were enough at the time for me. He was certainly a player in that top level of climbing at the time, more than I gave him credit for.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, it's really tricky, isn't it? I think there's a lot of people operating at that kind of level at the time, and you got to chop some people, haven't you? They can't all make the cut. I think interesting you're saying you're going to potentially discuss open air in the 2000s. I think that'll be a really interesting discussion there around kind of like the whole kind of first of the grade thing, because it's a funny one, isn't it? In some ways, it's obviously climbers don't fall into neat little buckets of difficulty. It's all a big sort of messy spectrum, and I feel like particularly with 9A plus, looking back, all these routes that have basically been upgraded because they're like now considered a bit harder than they were initially. And I think open air is a good example of that. So it's fun, isn't it, when you look back and you're doing this kind of first of the grade thing. Actually, often it's a bit revisionist. At the time, people suggested it was this, that, or the other, and now it takes 10, 15, 20 years for these routes to get enough repeats to sort of really settle down and everyone to kind of understand. And I think potentially even more sort of in that kind of time frame, in the 90s, people maybe didn't travel quite as much. I think of like Steve McClure's rotation at Raventor, got very little attention, right? There's probably some other factors in there as well, like, it's not the most attractive route or anything.
I was going to say, maybe people just weren't going to Raventor.
I think you might be right there. Yeah, I think there's a funny quote from Chris Sharma where he's like, "I will never do this route." The implication being because it's so crimpy and disgusting, and at
Yep.
Raven Tour.
Yep.
Yeah, it makes me laugh. But yeah, I think Mutations is like an example where like Steve put it up at 9A, and then actually it's taken 20 something years to get repeated, and
Yeah.
now it seems like it could be 9A plus.
Yep.
But obviously took Will Bosley a lot of effort. I think he ended up putting like 40 sessions into it or something like
Yeah,
that.
and he even suggested it could be 9B, right?
Yeah. Well, because he did. There's another project at Raven Tour that's sort of stood the test of time for quite a while, and I think he suggested 9A plus for that. Did it in 5 or 10 sessions or something. So it's definitely he's putting the hours in on Mutation for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And that certainly was on my radar. And when I talked to Steve about Hubble, I brought up Mutation and Will doing it. And Steve's quote I thought was really excellent. And he said, if it is 9A plus, it wasn't 9A plus for me. And it adds another layer of complexity to this whole grade conversation. Like, okay, maybe it's 9A plus now for everyone, but was it 9A plus for Steve when he did it based on whatever? Maybe the shoes were stiffer and that was better. Maybe that style was just more in and he was more steeped in it at the time. Maybe it fit his strengths really well. And how do you weigh that, when it's this quality that's
Yeah,
not a static thing? So it's such a
yeah,
tough
completely.
conversation, but Steve absolutely deserves to be talked about in that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, you're totally right. It's like grades could be so. I think particularly in that when you get into the real corners of style, the real specialisms, and Mutation is definitely in that bracket. It's really
Yeah.
vert, it's really small holds, like really simple
Hmm.
little footholds. It's hard enough for the best of times to nail down a grade for those kind of things, let alone when it's like right the cutting edge of difficulty in not a very popular style.
Yeah.
It's
And it
not
has a
super surprising.
and it has a really strange move that you never see maybe ever again on a route. Like, I don't know that I've ever seen anyone do a move like that crux move of Mutation.
Yeah, it's a really odd kind of shoulder roll thing, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah,
really cool, really interesting. Like, I love that Steve was operating at a level where he could figure out this really difficult move that's different than anything we've seen. He didn't go build a simulator or have someone pour the holds and build a simulator of it. He just went and did the thing. And, he's such a humble guy. And I really admire the way he approaches it all. And honestly, I did a ton of reading for season 1, and his book was my favorite of all of the books that I read. Um, it just really got me excited about the climbing in that era, and like seeing Steve's reflections on it are incredible.
yeah. It's funny, isn't it? He's so humble. If you didn't know what he'd done, you'd think he was like climbed like 7A, 7B,
Yeah,
something like
exactly.
that. Oh, I never done anything hard. I never really trained at all. And
Yeah.
he's out there putting up these wild routes. Like, what always surprises me is Mutation was so early on in his sport climbing progression.
Mhm.
I think it was only certainly less than 10 years, maybe even like 5 or 6 years, something like that. Since he did his first like real sport routes, he kind of went
Right.
from like 8A to 9A in the space of like a handful of years, which is
Yeah.
just wild. Especially yeah, maybe because of that really specialist style. The really thin, crimpy side of things. Maybe he sort of really found his niche there and progressed in that. But I think when you look at the other routes he's subsequently done, actually, he's a very capable, like pretty all round climber as well. So I think
Yeah.
that progression is almost unheard of, really. When you look at
Yeah, it
the
really is,
you know,
especially back then.
yeah, exactly. I think you probably have to wait until someone like Ondra or Dave Graham a few years later to see similar. But yeah, Dave Graham actually is probably a good example, isn't it? I think he was particularly in bouldering. He sort of over the space of 2, 3, 4 years progressed like really, really
Mhm.
quickly up to the highest level.
Yeah, and Sharma's another example of that, though. When he was getting to that level, it was the highest level in the world, and he, was seeking out these beautiful lines as opposed to, going and climbing on whatever hard thing he had close to him. So it definitely slowed down what he was doing, I think. And that's one of the benefits of a place like Ravenstor. Is it Ravens with an S or just Raventor?
I think just Raventor. Very
Okay.
confusingly, there's another Raventor nearby, which I think is called Ravenstor.
Oh,
Within
really?
sort of like 10 or 15 miles, something like that. So it's
Interesting.
easily confused.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the real benefit of a place like Raventor is that, you get these really hard, difficult challenges that can be local-ish to a group of climbers. And like Raventor is a catalyst for pushing grades higher, beyond the 8th grade, getting into the 9th grade. Raventor is definitely a big piece of that history that just absolutely can't be ignored. Um, and Steve fits in right in there with Ben as far as I'm concerned.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think the kind of nature of the crag as well. Yeah, I think it really lends itself to that kind of like link ups to limits and things like that.
Mhm.
And I think when you look at routes like mutation, you can kind of see them evolving. Yeah, mutation is obviously a variation on evolution, which is like the whole play on the name. But that
Right.
kind of environment where you've got people who are going to the crag and you've already got some hard routes to try, but then there's this history of the eliminates and making up harder variations, all this kind of thing that really can push the level really high when you've got that kind of little like oven of people who are all kind of working together, all trying to improve together. But I think
Yeah.
Steve in particular kind of benefited coming off the back of that like Ben and Jerry kind of era. You still had that little hub of strong Sheffield scene, everyone going to Raven Tour and kind of working out there and using it a bit like an outdoor gym, really.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking that mutation is
Yeah, so you do evolution, but there's like quite a hard bold restart on not kind of thin crimps. So you do that for mutation, and then you basically evolution. You continue up with like another 5 or 6 moves, I think, to quite a good hold. Maybe it's the good hold you're thinking of there, where I assume there'll be other stuff that goes into it. But then mutation, you kind of do this hard bowl restart on evolution and then swing off right. So you do that kind of hard shoulder move you're talking about. And then there's another kind of 8A-ish bold problem on thin crimps from there. And that kind of gets you to the top of the route.
Yeah, I really like those sorts of link ups. I know they get, the thumbs down from a lot of people because they're not pure air quotes or whatever, but the reality of it is it's such a cool way to progress climbing, and it's a cool way to build on history. Written in Stoners, I'm breaking in here for just a second to let you know that this is a bonus episode that you're listening to that normally goes out only to our patrons. However, in an effort to help fund season 2, which is on its way, I'm trying out some new things, including this new feature that allows me to upload a free version and a paid version. And here are your options to hear the rest of this great conversation with Remus Knowles, of which there is an hour remaining, where he continues to critique and interrogate season 1. And he makes some really great points. So I do hope you listen to it. Anyway, here's the options. You can become a patron. There's a link right there in your show notes, and you'll get this episode for free. You can become a patron for free. There are also some paid episodes for patrons, but this is one of the free ones, including a recent episode with Matt Samet. So you're going to get some great content there. You can also do that via Spotify. You don't have to go straight to Patreon, though that does help us out a little more. You can listen to it on Spotify. If you're a Spotify listener, search for Secret Stoners Club. That's how you'll find all of the bonus episodes on Spotify. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can become an Apple subscriber right there in your feed, and you will get all of the bonus episodes, the free and the paid episodes there. And thank you for your support. I appreciate it more than I could possibly tell you.